The Saturday afternoon sun struggled to brighten the vast, fluorescent-lit space of the department store. It was a place of practical things, of checklists and errands. Shoppers moved through the aisles with a focused rhythm, their carts rattling with the sound of necessity-new lampshades, bundles of towels, kitchen gadgets still in their boxes. The air hummed with quiet conversations, the beep of scanners, and the distant whir of escalators dot in the middle of the home goods section. Between a display of plush pillows and stacks of ceramic dinner sets stood a public piano. Its polished black lid gleamed under the lights, a small sign on it reading, "Play Me." Most people walked past it without a second glance. To them, it was just another piece of store furniture, a nice idea that rarely came to life. Sometimes a child would bang on the keys, producing a loud, cheerful crash that would make parents smile and hurry them along. But most of the time, it sat quiet and alone, a silent island in a sea of activity. Near this piano, a teenage girl stood waiting. She had a simple backpack slung over one shoulder, worn smooth from use. She wasn't looking at the pillows or the dishes. Her eyes were on the piano, but her body was turned slightly away, as if she didn't want to draw attention. She wore comfortable, ordinary clothes that helped her blend into the background. Beside her, her mother was deeply engaged in the important work of comparing thread counts on two different sets of towels, feeling the fabric between her fingers with a serious expression. The girl took a small, almost invisible step closer to the instrument. Her fingers, resting at her side, flexed slightly. To anyone watching, she might have just been a bored kid, stuck waiting while her parents shopped. But if someone had looked closer, they might have noticed the quiet patience in her stance. They might have seen the way her eyes traced the pattern of the piano keys, not with curiosity, but with a kind of familiarity. She thought of the piano at home, the one that took up a big part of the living room. She thought of the countless hours spent there, not just playing, but listening, learning, feeling the music in her bones. It wasn't always easy. There were days of frustration, of repeating the same tricky passage over and over until her fingers ached and the notes seemed to lose all meaning. Her family didn't have a lot of money for fancy lessons or grand concerts. Her talent was built in those daily, persistent sessions at home, fueled by a deep, private love for the language of music. The piano was her place to speak without words. Here in this busy store, that personal world inside her head felt very far away. This was a public piano. Its keys had been touched by hundreds of strangers. It might be out of tune. A pedal might squeak. It was an unknown, and that was always a little scary. Her mother held up two towels. "Which white looks whiter to you?" she asked, breaking the girl's focus. "The one on the left," the girl said softly, her voice barely audible over the store's hum. Her attention drifted back to the piano. A little boy, maybe 5 years old, broke free from his father's hand and ran to the instrument. He slapped his small palms across the low keys with a joyful shout, creating a booming, discordant sound. His father laughed, swooped him up, and carried him away, the boy giggling. The brief, noisy interaction left a silence that felt even deeper. The piano waited. The girl's mother finally made her decision, placing the chosen towels in the cart. "All right, just need one more thing from the next aisle," she said, already starting to move. The girl nodded. "I'll wait here." As her mother disappeared around a corner of shelving, the girl found herself truly alone with the piano. The crowd of shoppers flowed around her, a river parting around a stone. She looked at the empty bench. It was an invitation, but also a challenge. Playing at home was one thing. Playing here, in front of all these busy, distracted people, was something else entirely. What if she made a mistake? What if no one even noticed? What if they asked her to stop? She took another step, her heart beating a little faster in her chest. This wasn't a stage. There was no program, no ticket, no expected audience waiting for her to perform. It was just a regular afternoon. But maybe, she thought, that was the point. The music wasn't meant for a special occasion. It was meant for now. Slowly, almost hesitantly, she slipped the backpack from her shoulder and let it rest on the floor. She wiped her slightly damp palms on her jeans. Then, with a resolve that straightened her back, she walked the final few steps and sat down on the smooth, cool bench. The seat felt different. The height was a little off. She adjusted herself quietly, her movements small and careful. She lifted the fall board, revealing the full set of black and white keys. She placed her hands in her lap for a moment, just breathing, shutting out the sounds of the store. In her mind, she was already somewhere else. Then she raised her hands and let them hover just above the keys. For a second, they were frozen there, a painter's brush before the first stroke. And then, with a gentle, deliberate motion, she let her fingers fall. The first sound was a single, clear note. Then another. She began to play a simple, beautiful melody. It was a warm-up piece, something gentle and flowing. The notes were soft, thoughtful, and they wove themselves into the air of the store without demanding attention. A woman pushing a cart nearby slowed for a second, a small, absent-minded smile touching her lips before she moved on. A store employee stacking glasses gave a slight nod, appreciating the pleasant background noise. The girl was barely aware of them. She was listening to the tone of the piano, to the way it responded to her touch. It was a decent instrument, she realized. A little bright, maybe, but the action was good. Her fingers, now remembering their strength and memory, began to move with more confidence. The simple melody grew a little richer, a little more heartfelt. But inside her, a different, more energetic rhythm was starting to stir. The warm-up was almost done. She was getting ready. The gentle melody flowed from her fingers, a soft stream of notes that felt familiar and safe. It was a piece she had learned years ago, one that required more feeling than flash. Her shoulders, which had been tight with the nervousness of sitting down, began to loosen. Her breathing, which she hadn't even noticed, was shallow, deepened, and slowed. The piano was becoming an extension of her, a familiar friend in an unfamiliar place. She played through the last few bars of the soothing piece, her touch light on the keys. As the final chord faded, her hands came to rest in her lap again. There was a brief, quiet moment. The ordinary sounds of the store, the distant whir of a vacuum cleaner, the rustle of a shopping bag. Two people discussing paint colors rushed back in to fill the space. That short performance was over. For anyone who had been half listening, it might have seemed like a nice little treat that had now ended. The girl did not get up. She sat perfectly still on the bench, her eyes fixed on the black and white keys in front of her. It was a different kind of silence now, not one of hesitation, but of preparation. The friendly warm-up was done. Now, something else was waking up inside her. A pulse, quick and lively, began to beat in her mind. It was the rhythm of a march, but not a heavy, plodding one. This was playful, full of spark and spirit. Slowly she raised her hands again. But this time, they didn't hover with uncertainty. They took their position with a quiet certainty, fingers curved and ready, poised over the specific starting notes. She took one last, deep breath, filling her lungs. Her back straightened until her posture was perfect, like a dancer about to begin. Then she began. The first notes were not gentle. They were bold, bright, and perfectly precise. Asterisk, da-da-dum. A crisp, staccato burst of sound that cut through the air like a firecracker. It was so sudden, so different from the music that had just been playing, that the very atmosphere in the aisle seemed to change. A man in a baseball cap, who had been comparing the prices of two coffee makers, froze. His head turned, not slowly, but in a sharp jerk towards the sound. His eyebrows shot up towards the brim of his cap. The woman with the cart full of towels, the girl's mother, was 2 aisles over, looking at laundry baskets. She heard the distinct, powerful notes and stopped. A knowing smile touched her lips, and she leaned back against a shelf, listening. She wouldn't go over there. She knew her daughter needed this moment alone, yet shared with everyone. Back at the piano, the girl was somewhere else entirely. The store, the people, the fluorescent lights, all of it melted away. There was only the music in her head, and the path her fingers must travel to set it free. Her right hand danced down the keys with incredible clarity, each note a tiny, perfect hammer strike. Then her left hand joined in, not as a background shadow, but as an equal partner, adding depth and a powerful marching bassl I ni dot asterisk da-dum, da-da-dum, da-da-dum-dum. Asterisk, the famous joyous tune of Mozart's Turkish march, exploded into the home goods section. It was unmistakable. It was the kind of music you might hear in a cartoon or in an old movie, something that sounded both grand and fun. But hearing it here now, from a teenage girl on a public piano, made it feel alive and shockingly new. Conversations died. Not slowly, but instantly. A pair of teenagers who had been laughing by the water filter display fell completely silent, their mouths slightly open. An elderly couple holding hands near the cookbooks turned toward the sound together, as if pulled by a single string. Their tired eyes, which had been dull with the chore of shopping, suddenly sparkled with recognition and delight. The little boy who had banged on the keys earlier was now perched in his father's arms, his small body utterly still. He wasn't bouncing or squirming. He was staring, mesmerized, at the girl whose fingers were moving in a blur. The girl's face was a picture of complete focus. There was no smile, no showmanship. Her brow was slightly furrowed, her eyes fixed on her flying hands, but seeing far beyond them. There was a slight, intense energy in her expression, the look of someone doing something very difficult, very fast, and doing it perfectly. Her entire body was engaged, leaning into the powerful parts, pulling back for the delicate, fluttering runs that sounded like laughter. The music wasn't just loud. It was full of life. It bounced off the high ceilings and the flat-packed furniture boxes. It danced around the racks of pots and pans. It turned the aisle into a stage, and every shopper within earshot into an audience member who hadn't known they were about to see a show. A young store employee who had been walking over with a clipboard, perhaps to remind people the piano was for gentle music, stopped in his tracks. He didn't lift his clipboard. He didn't say a word. He just crossed his arms and leaned against a column, his professional duty completely forgotten. A slow grin spread across his face. The piece demanded speed and power. The girl's right hand flew up and down the keyboard in thrilling scales, each note clean and distinct. Then, a sudden shift to a quieter, mischievous melody, her fingers barely touching the keys, creating a sound like tiptoeing. Then, back to the bold, triumphant march, her left hand pounding out the rhythm that made you want to tap your foot. No one was tapping their foot. No one was moving at all. They were all holding their breath, caught in the sheer surprise and skill of it. The gasp that had rippled through them at the first notes had settled into a profound, shared stillness. They were witnessing a secret, a moment of unexpected beauty plucked from an ordinary Saturday. And they all knew, without saying a word, that they had to be quiet. They had to listen. This was too special to miss. The music didn't just fill the space. It commanded it. That playful, marching rhythm became the new heartbeat of the store aisle. The girl was now deep inside the piece, in that zone where thinking stops and pure instinct takes over. Her fingers knew the map of this song by heart. They flew across the keyboard, not as 10 separate fingers, but as a single, fluid force of energy. A woman who had been intently reading the tag on a set of sheets let the fabric slip from her hands. She didn't bother to pick it up. She simply turned, her shopping list forgotten, and took a few steps closer. Her eyes weren't on the girl's face, but on her hands, watching the blur of motion with something like awe. How could they move so fast, and yet each note sound so clear? The man with the coffee makers slowly placed one back on the shelf. He didn't walk away to continue his shopping. He moved quietly, almost respectfully, to lean against a pillar, a short distance from the piano. He crossed his arms, a serious expression on his face, but his foot, inside his sneaker, had begun to tap very lightly against the floor. It was the only movement he allowed himself. The spell was spreading. From the neighboring aisles, people began to appear. They peeked around corners, drawn by the vibrant, unfamiliar sound cutting through the usual store music. A young couple, holding hands, abandoned their search for a new shower curtain and came to stand at the edge of the growing circle. An older man with a kind face, who had been sitting on a bench resting his knees, stood up slowly and shuffled closer, leaning on his cart for support. His tired expression softened into one of deep pleasure. No one spoke. There were no whispers, no comments to a neighbor. The only sound was the piano. The roaring, joyful sections made people stand taller. The quiet, tiptoeing parts made them lean in, as if afraid to miss a single sparkling note. They were all sharing a secret, a collective experience that felt private and grand at the same time. The girl was aware of none of this. The world had narrowed to the feel of the cool keys under her fingertips, the faint vibration of the piano cabinet, and the perfect sound she was fighting to pull from the instrument. This was the hardest part of the piece, a section where the right hand had to play a furious, chattering melody while the left hand jumped back and forth with powerful, precise chords. At home, she had practiced this part for weeks, until her muscles ached and the notes had threatened to turn into meaningless noise. But now, in this moment, it worked. Her left hand landed solidly, a reliable anchor, while her right hand skittered and danced. A faint sheen of sweat appeared on her temple, but her focus was absolute. She was not just playing the notes. She was feeling the character of the music, its humor, its pride, its unstoppable energy. From her backpack on the floor, her phone, buried under a schoolbook, buzzed silently. A friend was probably texting. She didn't hear it. The digital world, with its notifications and messages, did not exist here. This was an ancient kind of communication, one made of vibration and emotion, straight from her heart to the hands of everyone listening. Her mother, still listening from the other aisle, felt a warmth spread in her chest. She remembered the early days, the simple, plunking versions of Twinkle, Twinkle that had filled their small living room. She remembered saving up for months to buy the good digital piano that now sat at home. She remembered the patience, the frustration, the tears of disappointment when a piece wouldn't come together, and the blazing triumph in her daughter's eyes when it finally did. To hear all that work, all that private passion, suddenly burst into this public space was overwhelming. It wasn't pride for a trophy. It was pride for the journey, now echoing off the store walls for strangers to share. A little girl, maybe 6 years old, tugged on her father's jacket and pointed. "Daddy, look!" she whispered, her voice full of wonder. Her father nodded, lifting her up to sit on his shoulders so she could see over the adults. She stared, mesmerized, at the dancing hands. In her mind, a seed was being planted. "I want to do that," the thought whispered, though she wouldn't say it out loud. The store employee with the clipboard had been joined by a colleague in a red vest. They stood together, two young men paid to stack shelves and help customers. For these few minutes, their job was simply to be an audience. One of them shook his head slowly, a grin on his face. "She's incredible," he mouthed silently to his friend, who just nodded, his eyes wide. The music built and built, climbing higher and higher towards its finale. The girl's arms were beginning to feel the strain, but it was a good, familiar ache, the feeling of giving everything to the performance. Her breath came in short bursts now, matching the phrases of the music. She stole a single, flickering glance away from the keys. What she saw almost broke her concentration. Not a circle of people. More than 20, maybe 30. All silent. All watching her. For a split second, a bolt of pure panic shot through her. They're all looking at me. But the music was a train that couldn't be stopped. Her fingers, wiser than her fearful mind, kept racing forward, carrying her past the moment of doubt. The shock of seeing the crowd melted into a new electric energy. It wasn't fear anymore. It was fuel. She poured that feeling into the keys, her playing gaining an extra layer of power, a touch more bravado. The final famous section was approaching. The march returned, louder and more triumphant than before. Everyone in the crowd seemed to sense it was coming to an end. They braced themselves, not wanting it to stop, but eager to see how it would finish. The elderly man leaning on his cart nodded his head in time, a full, happy smile on his face now. The teenagers by the water filters had their phones out, not to text, but to record, to capture this strange and wonderful interruption to their day. The girl took a sharp, deep breath, her body coiling like a spring. This was it. The final stretch of the piece was a whirlwind. It was like a runner finding a last, hidden reserve of energy for the sprint to the finish line. The girl's hands became a blur of motion, a syncopated dance across the black and white keys that seemed almost impossible. The left hand hammered out deep, resonant chords that you could feel in your chest, while the right hand flew through a series of sparkling, playful runs that sounded like sunlight flashing on water. The people watching had stopped being separate shoppers. They had become an audience, a single group held together by the ribbon of music winding around them. The older couple, still holding hands, were now swaying just a tiny bit, their shoulders touching. The man who had been comparing coffee makers had a broad, unself-conscious smile on his face. The little boy on his father's shoulders had stopped even blinking, his mouth a perfect circle of wonder. The girl knew the end was coming. Every muscle in her arms and back was engaged, singing with the effort. Her focus was so intense that the world had shrunk to a tunnel, the piano in front of her, the music in her ears, and the ghost of the composer's ink on the page she had memorized years ago. She could feel the vibrations of the piano's strings traveling up through the bench, into her very bones. Then came the part she loved the most. The music shifted, pulling back for a brief, teasing moment. The volume dropped. Her fingers became light, almost tickling the keys in a mischievous, whispering melody. It was the calm before the storm. The crowd seemed to lean forward as one, holding their breath. You could have heard a pin drop between the delicate, tiptoeing notes. Even the distant beep of a cash register had stopped. This quiet part was the most difficult. It required absolute control, a feather-light touch after all that power. A single wrong note would ring out like a bell in the silence. Her brow was furrowed, her lips pressed together in concentration. She didn't dare look up now. And then it was time. She launched into the final, furious cascade of notes. It was a thrilling, racing descent down the keyboard, a musical landslide played with perfect precision. Asterisk boom ba dum dum, boom dash ba dash dum dash dum. The marching theme came back with a joyous, shouting energy. Her left hand pounded out the rhythm with decisive finality, and her right hand chased it, echoing and answering with brilliant, high flourishes. This was it. The climax. She put every ounce of her strength, every hour of practice, every bit of feeling into these last seconds. Her body moved with the music, leaning into the chords. The sound was huge, magnificent, completely overwhelming the humdrum atmosphere of the store. It wasn't just a song anymore. It was a declaration. For the shoppers watching, time seemed to slow down. The woman who had dropped the sheet set felt a totally unexpected lump form in her throat. She wasn't sure why. It was just a girl playing a piano in a store. But it was so much more than that. It was a moment of pure, unasked for beauty, a demonstration of what a person can do with dedication and heart. The young employee with the clipboard had completely forgotten about his job. He was just a guy, amazed by something beautiful. The girl's mother, listening from 2 aisles over, had tears in her eyes. They weren't sad tears. They were the kind that come from seeing a secret dream step out into the light. She heard the years in that music, the patience, the quiet determination, the private joy her daughter found in those 88 keys. To have it shared like this, so generously and unexpectedly, was a gift. Back at the piano, the final chords approached. The girl took one last, sharp breath, her arms rising high for the last. Powerful strikes. Crash. The final triumphant chord exploded from the piano. Rich and complex, a sound that seemed to shake the air. It wasn't a harsh crash, but a glorious ringing one. Her hands came down on the keys with solid finality, and then lifted, freezing in the air for a split second above the keyboard. And then, silence. A pure, total, resonant silence. The last note hung in the air, vibrating, slowly fading into nothingness. The girl's hands lowered slowly to her lap. She was breathing heavily, her chest rising and falling. She stared at the keys, now still and silent, as if surprised by what they had just done. The intense focus that had wrapped around her like a cloak began to loosen its grip. The sounds of the world started to seep back in the distant murmur of the store, the buzz of the lights overhead, but the crowd in front of her was utterly, completely quiet. For a long, stretched-out second, nothing happened. The man by the pillar hadn't moved. The little boy on his father's shoulders was still frozen. The elderly couple held their sway. They were all suspended in the aftermath of the sound, the echo of the music still ringing in their ears. The girl, her heart pounding now from more than just the exertion, slowly, nervously, lifted her head. She looked out, her eyes wide. She saw them. All of them. Their faces were turned toward her, expressions of shock, of delight, of awe. It was a sea of strangers, and they were all looking right at her. A hot wave of self-consciousness flooded through her. Her cheeks grew warm. What was she supposed to do now? A part of her wanted to just grab her backpack, slide off the bench, and disappear into the aisles. But before that thought could become an action, the silence broke. Started with the older man leaning on his shopping cart. He began to clap. Not a polite, gentle clap, but a strong, steady, heartfelt applause. His hands came together in a clear, solid rhythm. It was like a signal. The man in the baseball, who had been shopping for coffee makers, joined in, clapping loudly and letting out a sharp, approving whistle. The woman who had dropped the sheets began to applaud, her face breaking into a radiant smile. The 2 store employees clapped, their grins wide. The father put his son down, and the little boy started jumping up and down, clapping his small hands together with a pat, pat, pat. Then everyone was clapping. The couple holding hands, the teenagers with their phones, the people who had peeked over from other aisles. The sound wasn't wild or crazy. It was warm, sustained, and full of genuine appreciation. It was the kind of applause that isn't just a habit, but a thank you. The girl on the piano bench blinked, stunned. The warmth in her cheeks wasn't from embarrassment anymore. It was from something else, a dawning, incredible feeling of connection. She had been in her own world, and she hadn't realized she had invited everyone else into it. And they had accepted. They had loved the journey. A shy, disbelieving smile touched her lips. She didn't stand up to take a bow. That would have felt too formal, too much like a real concert. This was something different. So she just sat there on the bench, in her jeans and sweater, and gave a small, awkward nod of her head to the circle of clapping, smiling strangers. The applause washed over her, a warm, living sound so different from the crisp notes of the piano. It filled the space where the music had been, a human echo of the joy she had just created. She sat there on the bench, her hands now still and quiet in her lap, feeling the weight of their gratitude. The shy nod she had given felt terribly small, but the people just kept clapping. Their smiles genuine and unbroken got slowly. The rhythm of the applause began to soften. It didn't stop abruptly, but faded like a gentle wave pulling back from the shore, leaving a buzz of excited conversation in its place. The spell was breaking, but the magic of it still hung in the air. The older man leaning on his cart was the first to speak up. "Bravo!" he called out, his voice a little rough, but full of warmth. "Just wonderful!" Others murmured in agreement. "Amazing," said the woman with the sheets. The father of the little boy said, "You made our day, seriously." The girl offered another small, flustered smile. Her heart was still beating fast, but the panic was gone, replaced by a glowing, dazed feeling. She slid off the piano bench, her legs feeling a little shaky, as if she had just stepped off a boat onto solid land. She bent down to pick up her backpack, the simple, ordinary action feeling strange after what had just happened. As she slung the backpack over one shoulder, people began to move again, but differently now. They weren't rushing back to their shopping with their earlier single-minded focus. They were lingering, chatting with each other, glancing back at her with kindly looks. The man who had been shopping for coffee makers gave her a thumbs up as he finally walked away to continue his errand. The two store employees, still smiling, nodded at her before turning to go back to their work. She stood for a moment by the now silent piano, its black surface reflecting the fluorescent lights. It was just a store piano again, but it felt different to her. It felt like a friend who had shared a great secret. Then she felt a hand gently touch her arm. She turned. It was her mother. Her mother's eyes were shining, a little wet at the corners, and her smile was so wide it crinkled the skin around her eyes. She didn't say anything grand. She didn't gush. She just put an arm around her daughter's shoulders and gave a soft, tight squeeze. That squeeze said everything. It said, asterisk, I heard it. "I'm so proud of you." "That was yours, asterisk, ready to go?" her mother asked, her voice a little husky. The girl just nodded, leaning into her mother's side for a brief second. They began to walk away from the home goods section, past the pillows and the dinner sets. As they walked, a few last smiles were sent their way from strangers. They were almost to the escalators when a quick patter of footsteps came from behind. The little girl, the one who had been on her father's shoulders, came running up, her father following close behind. She stopped right in front of them, looking up with huge, serious eyes. "Can you teach me to do that?" the little girl whispered, her voice full of awe. The teenager looked down at her, and for the first time, her smile felt easy and natural. "Just keep listening to music you love," she said softly. "And practice a lot." The little girl nodded as if she had been given the most important advice in the world. Her father mouthed a silent, "Thank you," and took his daughter's hand. On the escalator ride down, the ordinary sounds of the store returned. Announcements about a sale, the beep of scanners, carts rolling. But it all felt a bit softer, a bit less hurried. The girl replayed the last few minutes in her head, the feel of the keys, the wall of sound, the shocking sight of the crowd, and finally, the sound of their hands coming together just for her in the car. As her mother started the engine, the quiet was comfortable. "That was something else," her mother finally said, glancing over. "You just gave that to them for free." The girl looked out the window at the parking lot, the other cars, the people loading their ordinary purchases into their trunks. "It felt good," she said simply. And it was the truth. The performance hadn't been for praise or to show off. It had started as a private conversation with a piano. But sharing it, seeing how it touched people, that was a feeling she would never forget. It was a feeling that was better than any trophy. That night, back in her own living room with her own piano, the house was quiet. She sat on her familiar bench and pressed a single key. The note sounded different here, warmer, more known. She played a few scales, her fingers tired but happy. She thought about the people in the store, the smiling elderly couple, the stunned employees, the jumping little boy. They were all back in their own homes now, their own lives. But for a few minutes today, their lives had all been connected by a thread of joyful noise. She didn't play the Turkish march again. That piece belonged to that afternoon. Instead, she started playing something slower, a gentle, flowing melody. It was just for her. But the memory of the day sat with her, a warm, bright spot inside. She knew not every day would be like this. Most days, practice would just be practice. But now she knew something new. She knew that music wasn't just something you kept in a room. It was something alive, waiting for a chance to leap out and surprise the world. And sometimes, the most ordinary places, between the towels and the toasters, could become the most perfect stage.